The hour of low bells came quietly. That was the worst part. Sarabeth had always imagined in the private dark of sleepless nights that the end of her reign would arrive, loud boots on marble, war horns, the crack of energy weapons, splitting palace stone. She had imagined noise, she had prepared for noise. It came like water under a door. The first guard left at the second bell. Torvin. 7 years in her service. He set his ceremonial pike against the wall with careful, almost tender precision, as though he might come back for it later, and walked out of the throne antechamber without a word. She watched him go. She said nothing. She was a princess Empress. She did not beg. The second and third left together. 4 minutes later, they didn't look at her. By the fifth bell, 6 were gone. She stood at the center of the antechamber in her formal state gown, gold and deep black, the colors of the Ashkara bloodline, built for visibility and grandeur, and absolutely nothing practical. And she watched the room empty the way a held breath empties, slowly, completely, until there's nothing left. The eighth guard paused at the door. Sarabeth recognized her. Melcia, the youngest of the detail, assigned only 3 months ago, still polishing her ceremonial armor in the mornings with the focus of someone who still believed the armor mattered. Melcia turned, and for one moment their eyes met, then she left. 9, 10, 11. The antechamber was a beautiful room that registered absurdly in the silence. The ceiling was carved obsidian and gold inlaid. The walls hung with tapestries depicting 30 generations of Velkin rulers, every one of them surrounded by loyal guards, loyal court, loyal empire. The tapestries were very old. The room was very empty. Sarabeth counted the doors. 3 exits, all unguarded now. Outside she could hear the coup organizing itself. Boots, orders, the specific controlled sound of a military movement that had been rehearsed. Vorith had been thorough. She would give him that. She turned toward the primary entrance, the grand double doors through which in 10 minutes, or perhaps 5, soldiers loyal to the High Chancellor would come, and found that it was not entirely empty. One figure stood in the doorway. He was not large by any standard that would have impressed a Velkin honor guard. Medium height, medium build, a human face she had seen every day for 4 months and spoken to perhaps 7 times, none of those conversations extending beyond protocol necessity. He wore his duty uniform, not ceremonial, practical dark fabric with no gold at all, because humans assigned as diplomatic gestures were not expected to dress for visibility. His sidearm was in his hand, not raised, just held like he'd picked it up the way someone picks up a tool they're about to need. Sir John Davoncal. She looked at him for a long moment. You are still here, she said. Yes, the others left. I know. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. He was watching the corridor behind him with the patient attention of a man reading weather. Why? She asked. He looked at her then. His eyes were dark and calm and contained something she couldn't name, because her entire civilization had never built a word for it. Because I wasn't told to leave. She turned that sentence over. It had the shape of a simple answer and the weight of something much larger. In Velkin military culture, a guard left when their oath was voided, when their commanding structure released them, when fear or incentive outweighed commitment. There were frameworks, there were mechanisms, There were formulas, because I wasn't told to leave, times fit none of them. No one told the others to leave, she said. They chose to, yes, and you also chose. Outside, the sound of boots grew closer. Not a guess anymore, certainty. Cal turned from the doorway and crossed the antechamber toward her. His stride was unhurried, and she found that unreasonably steadying. He stopped 2 m from her, assessed her dress, her footwear, the 3 exits, and made a decision that did not require her input. There's a service access panel behind the 3rd tapestry on the east wall, he said. Thermal maintenance corridor. It runs parallel to the residential wing and exits near the secondary comm relay. She stared at him. You know the service corridors? I know the whole building. That is not part of standard diplomatic escort protocol. No. He crossed to the east wall and pulled the edge of the tapestry back. Behind it, exactly where he said, was a maintenance panel. He had it open in 4 seconds, not forcing it, the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, who had perhaps done this many times. From the primary entrance, she heard the sound of the grand doors being tried, then a heavier sound. Forced. Cal looked back at her. She was a Princess Empress, 23rd in the succession line, who had become first. Through 18 deaths, she had survived a childhood in the Ashkara court, which was not a gentle place to be a child. She had carried the weight of a dying dynasty for 4 years and had not broken under it. She had never, not once, followed anyone. She picked up the hem of her state gown and moved toward the panel behind her. The grand doors gave. She went through the opening. Cal came through behind her, pulled the panel shut, and they stood in the dark of the maintenance corridor while the sound of coup soldiers filled the room they'd just left. She could hear orders being shouted, the sound of tapestries being moved, searching. It was very dark. It smelled of thermal fluid and metal, and the particular close smell of a space built for function and never for comfort. Cal moved past her and took point without being asked, his sidearm up, his footsteps making almost no sound on the metal grating. She followed. She was wearing state ceremonial heels, and they rang against the grating with every step, and she wanted briefly to scream. He paused, reached back without looking, gestured at her feet. She understood, reached down, unclipped both heels, held them in one hand. Grating was cold against her bare feet. She kept moving. Behind them, muffled through 2 walls of palace stone, she heard the coup finishing its work in the antechamber. Her throne, her tapestries, her guards' ceremonial pikes still propped against the walls, where 12 people had set them down on their way out. The corridor curved. Cal stopped, listened, moved again. She looked at the back of his head. This man, who had been a diplomatic token, a gesture, a human-shaped formality in an alien honor guard, and she thought about the answer he had given her. Because I wasn't told to leave. 11 guards had been given no instruction to leave either, and they had, and he had not. The difference between those 2 facts was the size of an empire. She didn't have the language for it yet. She wasn't sure her language could hold it. The corridor ran on, dark and close, and somewhere behind them the palace sealed its own exits as Vorith's forces took position. She was alone in the walls of her own palace, except she wasn't alone. That too was something she had no word for. The maintenance corridors had their own logic. Sarabeth understood logic. She had been educated in it, political logic, military logic. The long, slow logic of dynasty survival. She could read a court's power map the way other people read faces. She could calculate betrayal 6 moves before it arrived. She had not until now needed to understand the logic of a palace's thermal venting system. Cal understood it completely. He moved through junctions and splits and narrow diagonal shafts with the ease of someone navigating a familiar room. No hesitation, no second guessing. He took turns she would not have found, avoided. Others she would have assumed were passages, stopped twice at junctions to listen before choosing direction. He did not consult anything. It was all internal. They had been moving for 20 minutes when she finally asked, "You have been in these corridors before?" Yes. When? He didn't slow down. Every morning. First hour before post. She took 3 steps in silence. Your post began at the second hour. Yes, so you came early, each day. Alone, yes, for 4 months, yes. She processed this. It was not a complaint. It was not an explanation of dedication. He said it the way someone might say, "Times I ate before I came." Times a simple fact about what they did. No one assigned you to learn the service corridors, she said. No, no. One required it. No, no one rewarded it. A pause. Not discomfort. He was listening to something ahead. Then no, she let the silence hold for a moment. Outside the walls, somewhere above them, she could hear the structural sounds of the palace under new occupation. Doors being opened, rooms being cleared. The systematic sound of a building being claimed. Why did you do it? She asked. He said it like it was the least complicated thing anyone had ever said. You learn the building you're meant to protect. It was not a philosophy. He wasn't offering it as one. It was operational. A method, a simple statement about what protection actually required if you took it seriously rather than performed it. She had been surrounded by guards for 4 years, 12 of them formally assigned, oath-bound chemically and politically. Committed to her safety, they had stood at the right doors and worn the right armor and carried the right weapons. They had been, in every visible way, exactly what a protection detail was supposed to be. None of them had walked these corridors, not one. High Chancellor Voruth sat in Sarabeth throne room, her throne room, a fact he allowed himself to notice once and then set aside because symbolism was a tool and not a feeling, and looked at the man across from him, former guard captain Torvin, first to leave, the one Voruth had invested most heavily in. The human, Voruth said. Torvin shifted. Sergeant Kale, he didn't take the offer. No, Chancellor, the offer was generous. It was. I relate it personally, he said. Torvin paused as though uncertain whether the answer would satisfy. He said he wasn't interested. Not interested. Voruth repeated the words with the careful attention of someone holding an object they couldn't identify. What does that mean? I don't know, Chancellor. Voruth's senior advisor, a careful woman named Delash, who had spent 30 years studying Xene political behavior, said quietly from the side of the room, it may mean exactly what it sounds like. Everything has a price. Voruth said, in Velkan structure, yes. Delash chose her next words with the precision of someone diffusing something. Human loyalty mechanics may not operate on the same incentive framework. Their military history includes documented cases of soldiers refusing extraction refusing surrender, refusing reassignment, not because of chemical bonding or oath binding, but because of. She paused. It's poorly categorized. The literature calls it times voluntary. Commitment, persistence. The humans call it several things. None of the translations are clean. Varuth looked at her. You're telling me we couldn't buy him because he didn't want anything? I'm telling you we may have failed to identify what he wanted. Find it, Varuth said. Everyone wants something, Delash said. Nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The junction Kale stopped at was low, ceilinged and smelled strongly of processed coolant. He held up one hand and she stopped. He stood completely still. She heard it. A moment after he did. Movement ahead. Not mechanical, not the rhythmic thud of a pump or the hiss of a vent cycle. Footsteps, 2, maybe 3 people. Moving in the corridor ahead with the careful quiet of people who thought they were being subtle. Kale's weight shifted slightly. She saw his grip on the sidearm change. He looked back at her and pointed the wall behind her, a recess panel housing 2M back. She moved to it without sound, pressed herself into the recess. He pointed at her, then at the floor. Stay. Then he moved forward and she lost sight of him in the dark. What followed was not long. Maybe 90 seconds. She heard very little. One impact, something hard meeting. Something solid, a short exhaled sound. A shuffle, a second impact, silence. Then a third sound she couldn't identify. Then nothing. His footsteps came back. He came around the junction corner, sidearm at his side, and looked at her with the same expression he'd had for the last 20 minutes. Calm, present, slightly perpetually watchful. 3 scouts, he said. They're sleeping. She chose not to ask what time sleeping times meant exactly. They moved forward. Again, at the next junction she found herself looking at the wall instead of the path ahead. The tapestry of the Velkin ruling house had included scenes of great battles, her ancestors, surrounded by warriors, protected by sworn blades, honored in history for the loyalty that armored them. The loyalty was always depicted the same way. Formal, ritualized, grand, a man walking dark corridors alone every morning for 4 months didn't look like any of those tapestries. It looked like something quieter, something with no ceremony around it and no audience and no reward. She didn't have a word for it. She was beginning to think that was the point. Kale stopped again at a final junction. Above them she could hear the distant echo of the palace's occupation. Continuing. Voices, orders, the new shape of her world being installed over the old one. He pointed up at a hatch in the ceiling. Sealed but not locked, secondary comm relay, he said. Above this. Serve as access. It won't show on their sweep maps because it's listed under maintenance. Infrastructure, not communications. She looked at him. You know what their sweep maps will show. I know what standard sweep protocols prioritize. A beat. I read the intelligence briefs, all of them going back 8 months. Those briefs were classified to senior diplomatic staff. Yes, she thought about all the things she wanted to say to that. Settled on. Were you given access to them? A pause. Not officially. She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was dark and cold and smelled of machinery. She was barefoot, in a state gown, holding her own heels in one hand and standing in the maintenance walls of her stolen palace. Something moved through her, not comfort exactly, not safety, something more specific, the particular sensation of realizing that someone had been paying attention when you didn't know you were being watched over, that someone had been building something quietly in every early morning hour, and you had been the reason. Sergeant Kale, she said. Yes. Is there anything about this palace you don't know? He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything, the flower arrangement schedule in the East Garden. He said, I never looked into that. She almost laughed. It caught her off guard. That near laugh, the way things catch you off guard in the dark when your whole world is on fire. She swallowed it. Kale was already moving toward the hatch. She followed. The ambush was waiting at the secondary relay corridor, not a sweep, not a scan. An actual ambush. 4 soldiers pressed into the alcoves. On either side, weapons ready. Which meant someone had anticipated this route, had known about the maintenance hatch, had done, Sarabeth thought distantly, some homework of their own. She had half a second to register all of this before Kale registered it faster, moved in front of her, and the corridor turned loud. She had seen trained Velkin guards run combat drills. She had watched ceremonial exhibitions, formal weapon demonstrations, the ritualized choreography of violence that imperial court life occasionally required. She knew what a protection unit was supposed to look like in a fight. She had a mental image of it. Kale did not match that image. He did not fight beautifully. There was no choreography. He moved through the 4 soldiers the way a man moves through a problem, efficiently, without wasted motion, making use of whatever was close. Corridor walls, the angle of a weapon being raised, the fact that 2 of the 4 were positioned too close together, and that fact was a mistake he immediately used. He was not elegant, he was quick, and he was precise, and it was over in less time than she would have believed. She stood at the corridor's entrance and counted 4 Ku soldiers on the ground, not moving, and Kale standing in the middle of them, checking his sidearm with the calm attention of someone checking a tool after use. The corridor was quiet. Again he turned and looked at her. Are you hurt? She had not moved. She had not been in range. No, he nodded. He was breathing harder than before. The first sign she realized that any of this was costing him anything. His hand had a small cut across the knuckle, dark with blood, and he looked at it briefly and set it aside in his attention, the way you set aside things that are real but not urgent. She looked at the 4 soldiers, then at him. Are you hurt? She asked. He seemed faintly surprised by the question. No, not seriously. They moved further into the corridor, away from the bodies, deeper into the space between palace walls. She walked behind him and watched the set of his shoulders and thought about the question she wanted to ask, the one that had been building since the antechamber. She asked it. Are you afraid? He didn't answer immediately. He was checking a junction, verifying the space ahead, doing the ongoing work of keeping them alive. Then once they were clear and moving again, he said yes. She had not expected that. Not the word, not the simplicity of it. Her honor guards had been, every one of them, selected in part for their neurological and biological capacity for courage under pressure. The Velkin guard selection process included months of conditioning. Fear response was not eliminated exactly. It was managed, redirected, converted. The guards did not feel afraid the way ordinary people felt afraid. That was what made guards. "You are afraid," she said. "Yes, and you're still here." He glanced back at her. Just briefly. "Yes, I don't understand that," she said, and she meant it as a simple statement of fact, not criticism. She genuinely did not have a framework. If you are afraid, then the fear is real, and if the fear is real, then the danger is real. And if the danger is real... She paused. "Why does the fear not move you away from it?" He walked in silence for a moment. "That's not how it works," he said. She waited for more. He offered nothing more. The sentence sat there in the narrow dark of the corridor. "Times, that's not how it works, times." And she turned it over and examined it from multiple angles and could not find the part she was supposed to understand. Because in Vulcan logic, that was exactly how it worked. Fear existed as a signal. A signal existed to produce a response. The response to danger was withdrawal, or it was chemically suppressed courage, or it was the mathematical calculation that duty outweighed survival. There were formulas, there were mechanisms. The Vulcan had spent centuries building systems around the problem of fear because fear, left unmanaged, was a liability. Kale was not using any of those systems. He was not suppressed. He was not calculating. He was not managing the fear away. He was afraid, and he was here, and those two things were apparently not in conflict. For him, they coexisted. He carried the fear the way he carried his weapon, as equipment, present, accounted for, not in charge. She had no word for this. She tried to find one in silence and failed, and kept walking. 3 corridors and 2 maintenance junctions later, he stopped at a wall terminal that should not have been functional. Secondary relay access, supposedly decommissioned 2 years ago during a palace infrastructure review. She had signed the infrastructure review. She had at that time been assured it was thorough. Kale opened the terminal panel with a tool from his jacket. The panel was live. That terminal was decommissioned, she said. The record was updated, he said, working the interface. The terminal wasn't. She watched him navigate the relay system with the same calm precision that he navigated everything else. He knew the menu structure without reading it. He was not guessing. "You've used this terminal before," she said. "Once, to verify it was still live." "When?" 3 months ago." She sat with that for a moment. 3 months ago he had come to a decommissioned terminal in the walls of a palace he was assigned to guard, and verified that it still worked. He had not been assigned to do this. He had not reported it. He had simply filed it away, the quiet knowledge that if something went wrong, there was a live wire in the wall that no one else knew about. "Who else knows about this terminal?" she asked. "No one living," he said. "The maintenance engineer who originally decommissioned it retired 18 months ago." He pulled up a communications interface and began composing a signal. She moved closer and read over his shoulder. It was not a distress call to human diplomatic forces. It was a targeted message to 6 specific individuals. She read the names, and her breath changed slightly because she recognized every one of them, members of her loyalist inner circle, people she trusted, people who had not been present in the palace on the night of the coup, and who would, right now, be waiting for Word that she was alive. How do you know these names? She said. I paid attention to my private correspondence. No. To who visited you, in what order, how they walked out versus how they walked in, which ones you watched until they turned the corner, which ones you didn't. You can read a loyalty map without the correspondence if you watch long enough. She stared at the side of his face. He was still composing the message, adding something to the end. What are you adding? She asked. The names, he said, of every guard who left with timestamps in their financial contact records. She went very still. You have their financial contact records? I suspected the approach was coming 6 weeks ago. I started documenting movement patterns. He sent the signal. The terminal chimed once quietly and went dark. The contacts are indirect routing through third parties, but the chain is traceable if you know what you're looking for. She was quiet for a long moment. You documented a potential coup, she said, while assigned as a diplomatic token escort, without orders, without resources, without telling anyone. Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? I wasn't certain. And GT, clear his throat. And GT, I didn't want to create a political incident on a suspicion, and if you had been wrong, he thought about it, then I would have had careful notes about nothing. The terminal was dark. The signal was sent somewhere in the city. 6 people she trusted were about to receive information that could crack the coup's foundation open from the outside. She stood in the tight maintenance space and looked at this man, this human soldier, who had been placed in her guard as an afterthought, a gesture, a diplomatic token that nobody thought to account for, and felt something that her language had no clean word for either. Not gratitude. Gratitude was too small and too transactional. Not awe. Awe had distance in it, something that sat in the chest like weight, like the specific gravity of realizing that you were seen, not performed for, not documented, not cataloged, time seen by someone who had no obligation to look. She didn't say any of this. She said, "We should keep moving." He said, "Yes." They moved. The signal took 11 minutes to reach all 6 recipients. Sarabeth knew this because Kale had told her, and she had been counting since the terminal went dark, not consciously, a part of her that had been running Empire logistics since she was 14 simply started tracking it the way a body tracks pain, automatically, without asking permission. 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, they moved from the secondary relay shaft to a residential maintenance junction 3 levels above the palace's east wing. Kale had mapped a route that avoided every primary corridor and 3 of the 4 places where Vareth sweep teams were likely to set a static post. The 4th post they heard from 40M back and went around. She had stopped asking how he knew things. The answer was always some variation of the same thing. He had looked, he had paid attention, he had arrived early and stayed late, and treated the unglamorous work of preparation as the actual work, rather than as the prelude to it. At the junction they waited. The waiting was harder than the moving. Moving had purpose and direction. Waiting gave her mind space to do what her mind had been doing for 4 hours. Reconstructing the night, examining it, testing it for the moment she should have seen and didn't. Torvin, 7 years. She had trusted him. The others, some of them she had promoted. Personally, she was not naive about court loyalty. She had grown up in a court where Loyalty was a currency that rose and fell with proximity to power. She had understood in an abstract political sense that every sworn guard had a price and a breaking point and a calculation they were running beneath their oath. She had understood this the way you understand things you've been taught at a distance intellectually, without it ever fully landing in the body. It had landed now. Cale sat against the corridor wall, his weapon on his knee, watching the junction with the steady patience of a man who had done a lot of waiting in his life and made peace with it. The cut on his hand had dried. He hadn't addressed it. She found herself watching it anyway. You knew, she said. He looked at her. 6 weeks ago, you suspected the approach. You began documenting. She kept her voice even. You knew something was building and you stayed anyway. Yes. That seems like the relevant moment to leave, she said. If you were going to, I suppose it does, but you didn't. No, she waited for an explanation. He didn't offer one. She was learning that about him. He didn't offer explanations unless asked for them directly, and even then they were specific, functional answers to the specific question asked. He didn't perform reasoning. He simply had it and used it and left it alone otherwise. Why? She asked directly. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question. The way he was quiet, she had learned, meant he was giving it genuine thought, rather than reaching for an easy answer. Knowing it was coming seemed like more reason to stay, he said, not less. She looked at him. If it had been a routine assignment and nothing was wrong, he said, then leaving would have cost very little. The risk would have been low. He glanced at the junction, checked it, returned his attention to her. The moment I suspected something real was coming, that's when leaving became a choice that had actual weight. I don't leave when the weight gets heavier. She processed this for a long moment. In Velkin political philosophy, the rational response to increasing risk was increasing calculation. You measured the odds. You adjusted your position. You did not simply declare that the weight of a decision was a reason to hold the position rather than abandon it. That was not rationality. That was something else. She didn't have a name for it. She was beginning to compile a list of things she didn't have names for. Across the city, the signal arrived. The first to act was a woman named Counselor Vareth, small, sharp, 3 decades in imperial service, and possessed of a particular quality that Sarabeth had valued in her since the beginning. She moved fast when given a reason to. She read Cale's message twice. The second time she was already sending copies. The financial records landed in 14 places simultaneously, not accusations, a ledger, names, timestamps, connection chains, documented with the patient, methodical attention of someone who had been quietly building a case for 6 weeks. Without anyone noticing, the chains were indirect, routing through shell contacts, third-party arrangements, the paper distance that political money always used. But the chains held. They were traceable. They were for anyone who knew how to read this kind of record. Completely damning. Vareth's network had been built with precision. Every guard purchase, every political incentive, every quietly placed financial arrangement, it had all been designed to be undetectable. He had used routes that bypassed imperial intelligence oversight. He had used intermediaries with clean Records he had been by every standard available to him careful. He had not accounted for a human sergeant with a methodical habit and a very long memory. The network came apart over the next 3 hours, not in a dramatic collapse the way a bridge collapses when the weight finally exceeds what the supports can hold. Structural, irreversible, and somehow surprising anyway, despite the fact that the math was always inevitable. Counselors who had been sitting quiet, waiting to see which direction to align, received the records and made the calculation that they did not want to be on the side with the documented financial trail political officers in 3 districts who had been holding Vareth's position suddenly found reasons to hold a different one. 2 military commanders who had been given vague assurances and no specifics were given specifics, not by Sarabeth, not by her loyalists speaking to character or appealing to allegiance, by a ledger, a fact document, numbers and names. 1 human sergeant's notes. Vareth knew it was over before his advisor told him. He felt it in the communications coming in, the hesitations, the changed language, the specific political vocabulary that people use when they are creating distance between themselves and a sinking thing. He had been in court politics for 40 years. He knew the sound of desertion. His advisor Delash brought him the news directly when it could no longer be managed into a softer form. She laid the intelligence summary on his desk and said nothing. He read it twice. The financial records, the connection chains, the timestamps that matched precisely the movements of intermediaries he had never named to anyone outside his inner circle. How? He said. Delash said quietly. The records came from Sergeant Kale. Vareth stared at the summary. He was a token appointment. Yes, he was assigned as a diplomatic gesture. He had no intelligence clearance. He had no resources. He had no mandate. Yes, then how does he have these records? Delash said carefully. I think he built them over time. From observation, the silence in the room was very complete. Vareth looked at the records again, at the 6 weeks of documented movement, at the careful chain of evidence assembled by someone who had no official reason to assemble it and no official support in doing so. Someone who had been in the background of every function, every corridor, every public movement of the Princess Empress's court for 4 months. Present quiet, largely ignored. Everyone wants something, he had said to Delash. Hours ago, he thought about that now. What does he want? He said. Delash was quiet for a moment, then. I don't think that's the right question, Chancellor. He looked at her. I think the right question, she said, is what he already decided. Before any of this began, Vareth looked back at the records. Outside he could hear the sound of his carefully assembled coalition changing its mind. The restoration ceremony was scheduled for the 3rd morning. Sarabeth had not slept before it. This was not unusual. She had not slept cleanly since the age of 14, when the succession wars that would eventually leave her as the last Ashkara began. Their work, sleep, was something she managed in pieces briefly between one threat and the next. She had made peace with this years ago. The body adapted. She stood at the window of the east wing chamber. Her chamber returned to her, smelling of the incense her staff had set to signal normalcy back into the air, and watched the city below begin its morning. The sky was the color of Old copper at this hour, and the streets were quiet. And somewhere below the east garden, groundskeepers were doing the things that groundskeepers did while empires rose and fell and rose again. Above them, she thought about the flower arrangement schedule, a near laugh. Again, she turned from the window. She heard the door one knock, the specific pattern that belonged to her senior aide, and said, "Send him in." Cale entered the way he always entered any room. Check the space first, the door second, her third. Not disrespectfully, the way a careful person enters a room they are responsible for. She had been watching this habit for 4 months and had not noticed it until 3 days ago, and now she could not stop noticing it. He stood at the appropriate distance, informal. Clean uniform this time, the ceremony required it, and he had appeared in it. Without being reminded, he looked the same. He always looked the same, the cut on his hand had been wrapped at some point, neatly, without making a thing of it. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She said it, "I want to offer you a formal title. Land grant. Third-tier holding, Eastern Territories. The ceremony can include a recognition clause that would give your family dual Velkin and human diplomatic standing for 2 generations." He said nothing. Waiting, alternatively, she continued. A financial compensation package calibrated to the intelligence value of what you documented and provided. Figure would be significant. Our economic attaché has already calculated. A range, still nothing. There is also a blood bond ceremony option. It's ancient and rarely performed with non-Velkin, but it has been done twice in recorded history. It would formally induct you into the imperial house, cross-species legal protections that would follow you regardless of posting. She stopped. He said no to all 3. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. She asked anyway because she needed to ask, "Is there something else?" Name it. No, there must be something you want. He thought about this. Genuinely, visibly, the careful pause she'd learned to read as real deliberation. Then, "I'd like to stay on the detail." She blinked. "As my guard, yes. The assignment that has a modest stipend and no title and requires walking corridors at 5:00 in the morning." Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something that wanted to move through her, and she was holding it still through long practice. The habit of a woman who had learned early that visible feeling was a court liability. She held it still. "Sergeant Cale," she said, "why did you stay? I need the real answer, not the operational one." He was quiet. Longer this time. The morning light from the window came in at an angle, and she could see the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of years in hard postings, of a life spent in places that cost things because you didn't deserve to be alone in it. He said, "There it was, not duty." She had expected duty, the clean, transferable language of military obligation, something she could categorize and file in honor appropriately. Duty would have made sense. Duty had a framework, not loyalty. Loyalty, in Velkin understanding, was purchased or grown or chemically fixed. Loyalty had an origin she could trace, and a mechanism she could understand. Not even honor, which at least had ceremony around it, an architecture she knew, because you didn't deserve to be alone in it. It was personal. It was she searched and found nothing. It was chosen freely, completely, with full knowledge of the cost and the risk, and the fact that no reward was coming, and no one was watching, and no mechanism required it. She had survived by understanding that everything had a structure. Every act had a reason beneath it that could be found and mapped. She had built an entire political life on the reliability of incentive. People did things because something in them was fed by doing those things, and if you found the feeding mechanism, you found the person. She could not find his, not because it wasn't there, but because it was not the kind of thing she had been taught to look for. It was not a mechanism. It was a decision made once and held. That was all. That was the whole of it. The word that didn't exist in Velkin sat in the space between them like a shape she could see but not name. She breathed in once steadily and said, "Then you'll stay?" "Yes," he said. "Detail will be rebuilt, new appointments properly vetted. You'll be senior position. I don't need the, I know you don't need it." She said, "I'm giving it anyway. Not as payment, as a fact about what you are." She held his gaze. "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The restoration ceremony was long and elaborate and politically essential, and Sarabeth performed it with the precise, careful grace of someone who had been performing public ceremony since childhood, every word in the right order, every gesture correctly timed. The court watched and the cameras carried it to the Empire's outer reaches, and the message was clear. She was here. She had survived. The Eshkara line held. K stood at his post for the duration. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms, all of it. The corners and the doorways and the faces and the spaces between people, with the patient, total attention of someone who had made a decision and intended to honor it through every ordinary day that came after the extraordinary ones. Nobody at the ceremony wrote much about him in their accounts. He was again background, token position, the human, the honor guard, easy to overlook. In the years that followed Velkin, historians would write at considerable length about the coup of the low bells. They would analyze Voruth's miscalculations, the financial network that undid itself, the political coalition that could not hold once its foundational arrangements were exposed. They would document the brilliance of the intelligence work. They would note, as a curiosity, that the work originated with a human sergeant. They would not know what to make of that, not because the facts were unclear. The facts were thoroughly documented, but because the reason for the facts, the engine that produced them, did not fit any category their scholarship had built. He had no incentive, no mandate, no support structure, no expectation of reward. He simply had a decision. The scholars wrote around it. They called it an anomaly. They called it a fortunate accident of assignment. One academic in a paper that received mild interest and then was largely ignored called it the defining example of what she termed times voluntary commitment persistence, times the human tendency to hold a chosen position, not because external forces require it, but because internal ones have already settled the question. She had no word for it either. She borrowed one eventually from the humans' own languages. The translation was imperfect. It pointed at something like the thing that stays after every reason to leave has been satisfied. Every morning, before the detail assembled, Kale walked the building, corridors, maintenance junction, service shaft, relay rooms. Every exit, every weak point, every place a threat might come from, and every place a way out might exist. When all the obvious ones were closed, nobody required it. Nobody rewarded it. Nobody watched him do it. The building changed over time, renovations, additions, the slow evolution of a living palace, so the walk changed too. New routes, new things to know. He updated his knowledge the way he updated everything, quietly, thoroughly, without asking for acknowledgement. Sarabeth saw him once from a high window making the walk in the early gray of a winter morning, just a figure in the empty courtyard below, moving with deliberate purpose through the cold and the quiet and the total absence of an audience. She watched for a long time. She still had no word for what she was looking at. She was beginning to think the absence of a word was its own kind of meaning. That some things were real precisely because they didn't fit the frameworks built to contain them, that the most important things were always, somehow, the ones that no system had thought to account for. She turned from the window and went to begin the day. Below in the courtyard, he finished the walk and took his post. The empire held